and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the latest on Japan's election. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party picked former top diplomat Fumio Kishida on Wednesday to be the next prime minister, succeeding Yoshihide Suga. In his acceptance speech, Kishida vowed to lead a transformed party in a general election due within weeks. He seeks to tame the COVID pandemic, which has battered Japan's economy. Japan is preparing to lift all epidemic emergency measures nationwide beginning Thursday. So how would Kishida likely shape Japan's domestic and foreign policies? Could he succeed where his predecessors fell short? Time to turn to our panelists from China and Japan. On the latest change of Japanese leadership, we have in Tokyo, Kato Yoshikazu, research fellow from the Rakuten Securities Economic Institute. Also in Tokyo, Naoyuki Yoshino, professor emeritus with Keio University. Last but not least in Beijing, Jia Daojiong, professor from the School of International Studies with Peking University. Gentlemen, great to see all of you. What does that change mean in terms of Japan's politics and future directions? Mr. Jia, your judgment from China.
Most of the analysis I've read say that the new prime minister is a long-timer in the system, so he will be a force of stability or continuity of the policies. And Japan faces a lot of structural challenges that demands for continuity, but I don't really see drastic changes down the road.
Okay, yesterday, a new prime minister had the interview, and he was stressing the economic growth, recovery of economic growth, together with fair distribution of wealth. And that is a new direction for LDP members. I think Japan has suffered some kind of disparities in income after COVID-19.
I think the new prime minister is basically succeeding the previous administration because this is happening in LDP. In terms of Suga's legacy, he has to some extent lost some credibility or accountability from the public. So this is the main challenge for Kishida, and charisma matters, leadership matters. So this is not, I have not seen drastic change, but this is still very important election.
When it comes to economy, what are likely to be the policies? Professor Yoshino, during the campaign, does the new prime minister in any way revealed?
I think the new prime minister will continue the previous administration, and he's stressing the distribution of wealth and also subsidies for affected sectors, such as small and medium-sized businesses, restaurants, and so on. And that is a temporary good policy. However, it will accumulate government deficits. So his next agenda is how to cope with huge budget deficits together with the aging population. Pensions and social securities would be expected to increase more. So I think he has tackled about much more seriously about the aging issues. And the most important thing for Japanese aging issues, and it was not discussed among LDP members, is to postpone retirement age to bring them back to working force rather than relying on pensions and social welfare. And that will be one of the policies that Japan has to follow.
Right.
Otherwise, accumulation of deficits will be continued.
Mr. Yoshikatsu?
Yes, I completely agree with Professor Yoshino. And maybe, looking back to Abe's administration, the longest administration over constitutional history in Japan, actually he mentioned growth strategy. It's a very important, and, he opened up somehow for foreigners to boost the domestic consumption. And this is a challenge for Kishida as well, how to internationalize Japan's market, because now due to the coronavirus, now, basically no foreigner, tourists, comes in. But, after coronavirus or in a pandemic, how could Japan continuously succeed?
So it seems that, Professor Jia, your two Japanese counterparts are suggesting there's a short-term policy likely to be implemented, and there's a lot of long-term vision that needs to be addressed. Your thoughts?
Well, for the past almost 20 years, or at least 10 years or so, in spite of the fairly frequent change of prime ministership, somebody counted that the past 20 years, Japan had 10 prime ministers. That does give the impression of instability of leadership. On the other hand, when you look at the economic policies of Japan, Japan more or less carved out its own approach to managing micro and macro, especially macroeconomics, including the debt. Earlier there was reference to deficits, and Japan successfully maintained its cutting edge in a lot of these areas of technological innovation. Earlier there was a mentioning of aging, the challenges of narrowing income gaps. In that regard, Japan is becoming a victim of its own success, precisely because of its success, internationally speaking, in comparison with many other societies. More and more people in the society feel that they are left out, that they are not getting a fair share of the pie. And similar sentiments can be found in all societies here, including in China.
Let's think about some of these issues. First of all, many in this part of the world are very concerned about the potential of China-Japan relations. Now, even though Japan is not joining what is called the AUKUS, which is the U.S. test for how many the aid could bring to a side, likely against China, what is the temperature in Japan, and what is the extent of Japan that would go in order to accommodate the U.S. Toward China?
I would like to talk about the economic side of the policy. I think Japan, China, Korea, Northeastern Asia are closely connected to each other by trade. And also in near future, capital flows may become much more active. I think economic relations has to be very tight altogether. And in northeast of China, lots of infrastructure investment will be needed. I think the economic growth will come from the population growth too. So China is very important to grow now before the China is facing with aging population. The next one is digital commerce will becoming much more active.
Right.
I think that can contribute the trade among various sectors, including small businesses and agriculture.
But the question is, the economic side vis-a-vis the geopolitical and political side, how do you see which way is likely to win?
I think the economic aspects between China, Korea, Japan are very important. And the trade among three countries will benefit all of them. So I think we should focus on the economic side. And then some products are very difficult to negotiate. So we should start the easier products each other. And that is a way to proceed this trade debate.
Yeah.
And openness and capital flow, including capital flow.
We cannot hide from this question is, what does that mean, that balance between trade and economic ties and political and geopolitical ties? Professor Yoshino.
I think that political side is not so easy to complement because Japan is in between in US and China. But we could separate some of those political issues to the economic issues. And that is my own view.
Okay.
Rather than making them complicated each other.
Are you confident that the future Prime Minister will be able to do that?
I hope that the Prime Minister can do it, economic issues and political issues, a little bit separately, so that the trade negotiations and free agreement could be proceeded.
Professor Jia, same question to you. China-Japan economic ties getting ever more actually exciting with the multilateral trading platforms. But what's ahead? How much it will be under the shadow of politics and geopolitics?
With the CPTPP, there are some different opinions. I think that there was the expression of support, a welcome for Taiwan to application, and that's probably where your question comes from. But for China to apply to join the CPTPP is actually an endorsement of Japanese leadership after the U.S. left the original TPP. You have the United States, you have China, you have Europe, Japan, and now Australia is fully into the picture. But what I see is that in a strange way, probably that will turn out to be a plus for Northeast Asia, is that the U.S. has actually created a division of labor. The more hard security part, for example, by offering Australia the American nuclear technologies for weapons, that takes care of the so-called high security.
How do you see the immediate prospect of politics and geopolitics by the upcoming prime minister during his time?
On security policies or political diplomacy with China, the new prime minister is going to very much go with the flow.
Meaning?
All those intentional things, for example, strengthening ties with Taiwan or even providing military assistance to Taiwan, those things were said, were tested, but then, the response from the China, from the mainland, had also been clear. Japan will try to adjust and try to, quote unquote, not rock the boat. It will try to satisfy, the wishes of Washington, D.C., Beijing, or even Brussels, or Canberra for that matter, a little bit. But I think we need to understand that these sort of tensions are going to be structural. But a risk here is that some of the U.S. allies would probably be prodded, or if they volunteer to, quote unquote, be the deputy sheriff and do the so-called hard, dirty job in terms of escalating security tensions. That will be a challenge too. We'll see.
Will Tokyo do that job, quote unquote, Mr. Yoshihide? Is that in Japan's interest?
Yeah, I would say our new prime minister continued to prioritize Japan-US alliance, but he knows how important its economic ties with China. So I think Mr. Kishida, at least he is a person who can talk, and he has some experiences to working with Chinese leaders and including foreign ministers. So I think Kishida continuously pursued Indo-Pacific. So he is not going to reject any action by the United States, even some situation to contain the right of China, but he is not going to reject or oppose publicly. But I think he knows how important Japan-China economic ties and even some strategic issues for Japan, and this is a matter of stability in the region. And when it comes to TPP, CPTPP, I think still engagement matters. We hope let China engage in the development and peace in this region. So in this sense, of course, like Professor Jia mentioned, now it's related with Taiwan issues, so it's a bit complicated. But for Japan, there is no choice except for engaging China and CPTPP, because China has been concerned and interested in TPP for a long time, not now, so for a long time, and now try to engage more proactively. So this is a very important challenge for new prime minister. How to balance the Japan alliance and the ties with China. But I would say Mr. Kishida is a moderate, balanced, and open-minded person. So he at least he is willing to listen to others, including China. So let's see what's going on.
One of the things most people ask Professor Jia, just to respond to your Japanese counterpart, what will China's approach toward Japan as well? As we all know, it takes two to tango, and now probably even more players to tango. One could feed the others with excuses or with aspirations. How do you see China's approach to Japan under the rather complex circumstances?
I would think from the Chinese side, we have to recognize some fundamental changes in the Japanese polity. In other words, the war generation, the generation of Japanese leaders, elites that had direct experience of the war, including their families. That generation of leaders have left the scene. We're talking about almost 80 years after the war. The past 10 or 20 years of difficult relationships was driven in part by a gap here in China, emphasizing that, there was that war, and that's why China needs to be on guard. That's why Japan had to atone. But then on the other hand, the Japanese feel, well, that was something their ancestors did, and we should be moving on. But now by moving on, there is a new risk. You have a younger generation that have no direct experience or memories of the war, who come up with a lot of ideas that are quote unquote global or international, but these are sometimes intentionally confrontational. If I can be very straightforward, if you look at research findings, the whole idea of a Quad, that's Japan, US, Australia, and India, this kind of formation, just, they don't really have a lot of economic commonality. So what's left is for Chinese and Japanese scholars and academics and policymakers to be aware of, say, the challenge of rhetoric, or should I say, so-called future-oriented thinking, and where they don't, hopefully, they do come back to some common sense.
Let's wrap it up our conversation with a final sentence or two from every one of you on the question of where Japan is going and what does that mean for Japan's choice in terms of its relationship with China. Professor Yoshino.
I think the new prime minister should have the balance between politics and economics. And we have a huge trade relations between China and Japan. And we can keep on the peace and stability in the region in politics, and also the strong ties in economic relations.
Including the relationship and balance between geopolitics and economy, our new prime minister should pursue what is Japan's strategy, what is Japan's independent strategy to sustain and ensure our long-term development. And this is the real challenge for not only our leaders, but us, Japan's public. This is quite important.
There has been too long for the two governments and, let's say, real think tanks on both sides not to be seriously talking to each other. It's not more than frank and open. It's to have a bit of, let's say, politics of empathy, that is to seriously take the other side's position into consideration and try to, rather than just repeating built-in positions that are domestically recognized as politically safe. I would think that's a real challenge, and hopefully the next prime minister, under his leadership, there will be more real contact between the two societies.
加道炯, Kato Yoshikatsu, Naoyuki Yoshino. Gentlemen, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for your analysis.